Lynn holds a PhD and an MBA degree, and in the last 2020-21 year was president of the Water Environment Federation, an international organization of water quality professionals headquartered in Alexandria, Virginia. No doubt many of you are familiar with WEF and their great work. Lynn continues to serve on the board of WEF. Lynn formed Broadview Consulting, Inc. in 2014 as a platform for advancing sustainable, resilient practices in the water sector. She serves as a strategic advisor and facilitator for private sector, nonprofit, and philanthropic clients throughout North America, and is known for bringing new ways of thinking to the crucial environmental challenges of our day. And I dare say it is not an understatement to say that we certainly need new ways of thinking about the crucial environmental challenges of our day. So Lynn is certainly, well, as I said, we're just absolutely thrilled that she was able to join us.
I'm delighted to be here, and Ivan and Julia, I really appreciate the invitation to join. I have to say, so on that little quiz that you did at the beginning, I checked that I have been to a few, and it's a few equals one. And perhaps a lot of you are like me in that last year, the pandemic forcing Rich Earth to put their summit online afforded me the opportunity to attend. And I think there are a lot of people probably in my same boat, just looking at how far flung we are. It would be very hard for us to all physically get together. And but last year when I attended, I'd been curious about Rich Earth for some time, but to be able to come, I felt like, oh my gosh, I found my people. And I think probably a lot of you felt the same way. So it is great to be here among you. And I will say, kind of as a well, like caveat or whatever, I am sort of humbled to be with all of you, because you all are in on the forefront working on, and have been, some of you for decades, working on how to bring change. And I am really a generalist in all of this, and there's advantages and disadvantages to that, but I'm certainly speaking to the choir. And I will not be speaking very specifically about urine diversion. I'm really kind of trying to put change into a larger context in the water sector. Watching people roll in this morning and introduce themselves and seeing the wide range of time zones everybody is in is a little humbling. I am in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is an hour, one time zone west of Rich Earth's headquarters, but I know some of you are on the west coast of the United States or other American countries, North and South America, and I was wondering if anybody from Hawaii would show up. It's a tough time for them, though. They certainly have a lot of challenges that may benefit from the things that we're working on. I think that it's reasonable to say that each of us here is very interested in how to make change, and is working on change, particularly in the water sector, and thinking we want to really reimagine and can picture a totally different way of how humans handle their poop and pee. And one of the things I love about Rich Earth, when I came to the summit last year, is we just use those words, and we don't have to dance around it. And I was absolutely riveted by last year's discussion. And for me, it was sort of like Christmas. I felt like each new presentation was opening another unexpected present under the tree. And I'm sure that with this year's lineup, it will be no different. And, as I said, my role is a little bit different than everybody else's. I think that rather than offer up specific expertise about urine collection and its applications, how to finance it, et cetera, I want to kind of step back and put this into a broader context. Along with not only how we handle pee and poop and all the other kind of, air quotes, waste things in the developed world, and the challenges about how to make that change that we want to see. So, why are we doing this? I don't need to tell you that we have a challenging situation in the world. that we have, this past year was, at least in North America, the wildfires were daunting, and we could, I was far away from many of them, but oftentimes my skies were completely clouded out with the smoke from wildfires in Canada, and it's very distressing. And of course, flooding at the opposite extreme. We have increased levels of flooding, particularly coastal flooding, but not limited there. We have toxic algae blooms. This is an image from one of the Great Lakes. I think it's Lake Erie in the United States, and on the border of the United States and Canada, but this image I think is from the US side. And that of course stems from nutrients running off and from farm fields, road surfaces, lawns, and from wastewater treatment, and disrupting our fisheries, making it unsafe to swim, making it challenging for the drinking water. There was a number of years ago where the city of Toledo had to completely shut down its drinking water because of the toxicity from these cyanobacteria. We have collapsing infrastructure. This is an extreme example from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where you can see the vehicle down in there. The car's just driving along, and boom, the road just completely collapses from under it presumably because of water that had been leaking out of the water distribution system, and slowly eroded that infrastructure there. Now we have, in addition to those things, we have massive numbers of people on the move because for whatever horrible social unrest that may be happening in their region, not entirely disassociated from climate change here. This particular image is of people from Central America and Mexico coming up into trying to get into the United States. It's been a humanitarian crisis of big news and big concern in the United States. And then you put this pandemic on top of all that. And that has been disruptive for the way we work, has been disruptive for people's livelihoods, has really raised all kinds of uncertainty in our lives. And for, of course, we've lost many people. It's also sort of put a new light on the wastewater sector and its role in public health and how to address public health, how to use wastewater to help predict when coronavirus outbreaks are likely to occur, or where they're brewing. And then, also on top of all of that, we have concerns around concerns is a little bit of an understatement, concerns around greenhouse gas emissions. This image was taken from World Economic Forum report, and you can see the dip in emissions due to the pandemic, but that dip is rapidly erasing, and we have a lot of uncertainty about will we go back to where we were before, or will we be able to bend that curve down. And so, we have all these problems that we're trying to solve. And oftentimes when you're trying to solve a problem, now we can figure out how to fix infrastructure, but are we going to create other problems with our solutions? Are we going to exacerbate climate change? Are we going to make the system more expensive? Are we going to use more water in doing that? We need to find solutions that kind of solve for the complex equation all at the same time, that solves for public health, for water scarcity, for nutrient balances, for affordability, for climate change. And that's hard. But I think that the solutions that people in this group are looking at are in that vein of trying to solve problems without creating new ones. So let me just take a moment to put us in the context of, where are we starting from, at least in terms of our water and wastewater infrastructure. For most of the developed world, this is the way that we handle human excrement. And I want to be clear that I am not bashing centralized water delivery or sanitation. It has done a lot for humanity, And it is often cited as the driving factor behind what allows all of us to have cities and being able to live in close proximity today. Chlorination of city water and advanced wastewater treatment is what allows living as we know it today. So, but for all of its benefits, there are consequences and we need to understand those consequences as we look for innovations that will solve some of these other problems that we have. Now, let me just explain for a minute this image that we're looking at. This on the left, you see Deer Island Water Reclamation Facility, which serves the greater Boston area. I've got that sort of map on the right of where that serves. And so the green and yellowish green areas are what's served by this wastewater treatment plant, or what is also referred to as a water reclamation facility. On this image, Framingham's sort of in the middle of the page, and that's about 30 miles west of this treatment facility. 30 miles is roughly, let me do my math fast, like 45 kilometers or something, 40 kilometers, somewhere in there. And the treatment plant is out here. I don't know if you're seeing my cursor or not, but off on the kind of in the little part that sticks out into the water on the right side. And it's kind of funny that it's called water reclamation, because in this particular case, this sits out in the bay, which is, eventually feeds into the Atlantic Ocean. And so the water is really kind of thrown away. What happens is that water out in the all parts of this sewer shed, water is pulled in primarily from groundwater and to some extent surface water, used in the homes and in businesses, and then it's sent out to Deer Island for treatment. And because Massachusetts sits on the coastline, all that water then is put back into the ocean, where it's really, for all intents and purposes, unavailable. You'd have to put a lot of energy to get the salt and other constituents of the seawater out in order to give it back to people. So that seems like a waste. Now, in addition to just all the water that's being used by the community and that is sent out there for cleaning and then put out to the ocean, there's this system, like virtually all of these central sewer systems, leaks. And in so the statistics for this particular system, the groundwater is getting into the sewer collection system, sometimes through unintentional connections, but largely from the gaps that occur as the infrastructure starts to get older and fail. And so in this particular case, there's 62 billion gallons per year. Pardon me, I don't speak metric. I'm just so used to using American units. 62 billion gallons, which must be, I don't know, like 250 billion liters per year, that is unnecessarily being treated by the system. So it still goes through the whole cleansing process and is then thrown out to the ocean. And so I share with you this example as a way of describing how much unnecessary energy is being put into the system, how water is being transferred from the groundwater out to the ocean. And it is so bad that most of the surface creeks and rivers, because the groundwater table has been drawn down through this process, it affects base flow in those creeks and rivers, and sometimes it makes them run dry in the summer times. Anyway, so those are just some of the challenges here. There's also a lot of energy that goes into moving this water over these long distances. Now, as I said, I'm not here to bash centralized sewer, but I do want to put in context what are some of the downsides of this. and particularly around water, because I think that we're all people who share an interest in water. And I want to just kind of drill into that a little bit. Now, here we see a very well-known image from NASA, and it shows we look like a water planet. With 71% of the Earth's surface is covered in water. But when you drill into that a little bit, and this image is from the U.S. Geological Survey. So here, if we're thinking in terms of volume instead of surface area, it looks very different. So that little ball, the larger of those balls out there, is that represents how much water by volume we have on Earth compared to the Earth as a whole. And that ball is about 860 miles or 1,400 kilometers in diameter. And that's all of our all of the water on the planet. The smaller ball to its right represents all of the fresh water on Earth. And it is, well, you can see how much smaller it is, but it would be a ball of about 170 miles or 275 kilometers in diameter. And then this little tiny speck below it represents the fresh water that is surface water and is available to us through rivers, streams, and lakes. And that little ball is only 35 miles in diameter, or about 56 kilometers in diameter. In other words, yeah, we may be a blue planet, but there's not that much fresh water here for us to use. And just another sort of driving home the reason for why we need to be so careful with the water that we use. And we need to question, do we want to use this precious water for transporting human waste, which is the way we use it in most of our cities today. So just to summarize, some of the challenges with centralized water systems are, they disrupt the local hydrology, as I was trying to describe in that Boston example, but that's not unique to Boston. And of course, Boston and other places, they're working very hard to get that groundwater, what we call infiltration and inflow water, to get that out of the system, but it's still there. This is a huge problem. And it's sort of like in the US, we have this term called whack-a-mole, where you hit down, you fix one problem and the next problem pops up. So it's a never-ending problem of trying to keep that water out of the system. Large-scale transfer of continental fresh water to saline water bodies. And years ago, I saw a study that showed how much it is actually a measurable difference in the level of the sea level due to that transfer of continental fresh water, primarily groundwater, out to the oceans. It was, I forget exactly, half an inch or an inch, nothing compared to overall sea level rise, but it's measurable. These systems are very energy intensive because we are pumping water long distances, and water is heavy. So that's true both of the water distribution systems and of the wastewater systems. And it uses a lot of water. They're built on the premise of having really infinite supplies of water. So that's a problem in a water-stressed world. They're very expensive to build, to operate, and to maintain. And that's why we have the failing infrastructure that we do, and the challenges with maintaining that infrastructure, because at least in the United States, there were huge grants in the 1970s and 80s to build these plants as a way to address some of the surface water pollution that we had. And that was a good thing, but communities don't necessarily have the money to keep the maintenance going. There is over time, there's a loss of integrity to these systems. That's part of that failing infrastructure that caused leaks, both in water into the sewage systems at low water times, sewage out of the collection system, and then of course also leaks of water from the pressurized distribution systems for drinking water. Some of the other challenges that we're starting to get a little bit more focus on is this risk of catastrophic failure from a large flood. Certainly this has happened in the United States many times, where there's Houston during its storms, New York City and the region around New York during Superstorm Sandy in 2012. I mean, the list goes on. And when those systems go down, they go down for long periods of time and affect the entire region. We are also seeing, many of us predicted this for a long time, but supply chain disruption can have catastrophic impacts. During the pandemic, well, we're still in the pandemic, but in the height of some of the challenges with the pandemic, we saw communities in the United States and perhaps elsewhere asking people to conserve water because the ozone needed for treating water was needed at hospitals to create the oxygen for the COVID patients. So here we had the ozone was in short supply, and we had a disruption for that supply chain that affected. So COVID was affecting drinking water availability in a way that I certainly didn't predict. Concerns about cyber attacks. This has already happened where drinking water goes out because of a cyber attack. And certainly that could happen in the future. Just in general, these systems, because they're so big and they take so long to plan and so long to build, they are really inflexible physically and financially. If you overbuild it, you can't downsize it. You can't. So people tend to build for a future that they anticipate, which doesn't always come through. And then the community is left holding the bag. And then as time is now we are seeing that there are these significant operational challenges in both water distribution systems and in wastewater systems as the flow through them decreases. In water distribution systems, they're very dependent on maintaining chlorine residuals through that system, and those chlorine residuals degrade over time. So if the water is sitting in the pipes for longer periods of time, it can lose it loses its integrity, and it may become contaminated. In wastewater systems, we are definitely seeing challenges. I think these are good problems to have, but flow is decreasing because water use overall is decreasing, and we're getting more efficient. And then the wastewater stagnates in the system, and that can create system problems. So shifting gears to sort of think about how change happens and what is the change that's needed. Let me just give you some context for my background. In 2008, I had this incredible opportunity to go work for the Johnson Foundation at Wingspread. It's a small philanthropic foundation in Racine, Wisconsin, on Lake Michigan, sort of about an hour north of Chicago. And they had what I would call a retreat facility. They don't like to call it that, but basically a facility for bringing people together, groups of say 25 or so people together to work through problems. And they have the money to bring those people together. And they had decided that they wanted to work on water problems. Now, you got to picture 2008 in Wisconsin. Wisconsin has tons of water. Water challenges are not really, it's not like living in California. And so it was kind of surprising in some ways that they chose to focus in on water, but they didn't really have a good sense of what the water problems were. But they asked me to basically lead what became a 6-year effort on bringing people together around different challenges in water. And as you can see from some of the topics, especially on the left-hand side, we covered all kinds of things, water and agriculture, water and energy, which at the time was not something that people were thinking about, but also water and the built environment. Now, we held all kinds of meetings with all kinds of interesting people and came up with all kinds of thoughts about how to make what kind of change was needed. And towards the end of that 6-year period, we released a report that talked about the kinds of change that needed to happen, because we realized that people had different ideas about what kinds of change were needed. And in the this category of optimizing systems, there was like low-hanging fruit that that could easily be implemented within the existing paradigm. So this would be water conservation, energy conservation, looking for ways to lower operating costs, all those kinds of things, just tinkering with, or what some might call incremental change. Then there was, off on the right, there was a real transformative kind of change where, and I would say that people here today at Rich Earth Summit, my guess is that all of you would put yourself into that. The vision that you want to see is real transformative change. But how do you get there? And so we had this middle category of transition where people are kind of experimenting with some of these more transformative changes, and a lot of that is the kind of work that I think people in this group are probably focused on. So in this kind of first phase around optimizing, what kind of work? I'm happy to say that there is a lot of work going on in the water sector around change. And it may not be as fast as most of us would like to see, and it may not be as innovative as some of us would like to see, but change is happening. So let me just give you some examples of how that is happening. So I'll give a little plug for the Water Environment Federation, this organization that I'm on the board of and until recently chaired. The Water Environment Federation is, as most people would think of them as the big guys. It's people who work in the wastewater and stormwater sector, and increasingly in the water reuse sector as well. But they tend to be for the big or centralized systems, maybe not always huge, but traditional wastewater. And but the WEF, Water Environment Federation, has put out in the last 8 years or so guidance on how to pull the energy roadmap, how to help wastewater facilities move from being heavy energy users to being able to actually become energy neutral. They have publications on what we call the nutrient roadmap, how to do a better job of removing nutrients from the effluent so that there's less impact on the receiving water bodies, how to increase water reuse, and really getting guidance for communities and facilities on how to approach these things. And then starting to measure that. This is the year, I'm not really going to drill into the particular numbers here, but the point is, if you want to do something, you got to measure it. And so WEF has started surveying wastewater utilities on how much water, energy, nitrogen, phosphorus, and biosolids are you recovering from your waste stream. And the hope is that by highlighting these numbers and getting utilities to really measure this and report on it, that will help drive change. Another change that's happening in the sector is that water use overall, at least in the US, is declining. And I presume that in much of the comparable part of the world that we're seeing this as well. And this is over. So you can see these charts go from 1950 to 2015. And in the US over that time period, population has roughly doubled. So despite an increase in population, you can see from that left-hand image that water withdrawals overall are declining. Now, most of that decline is coming from a decline in thermoelectric power use of water, and that's great. But if you look at the image, in that image on the left, the purple bars are the water supply, the public supply of water. And it's a little hard to see a trend there, but if you look over on the right-hand image, which is just the public supply, you can see that it is definitely coming down, particularly over the last 10 years. And that is despite population growth. So that's through more efficient fixtures, through tightening up the systems, and of course, industry also becoming more efficient with their water. So this is a good thing. We're seeing a decline in water use. I'm sure we will continue to see that into the future, but it's not it's not a drastic drop yet. In order to be sustainable, we probably need a much greater drop there. Renewable energy generation, or kind of this road to energy neutrality, is a real thing that wastewater utilities are working on. They're certainly working on how to achieve efficiencies in their systems, especially with the pumps and blowers, where a lot of that energy is used. In fact, I forget what year this data comes from, but I think it's maybe about 4 or 5 years old. But roughly 2% of the electric use in the United States goes to water and wastewater, and that's primarily to the pumping and to the aeration of these systems. And so, looking for ways to reduce that energy demand is something that the sector is working hard on. But I'm pulling back to this image that I had earlier in just showing centralized wastewater system. And you can see out here that you probably will recognize the windmills in the bottom, wind turbines in the bottom left of that picture. So they're working to generate energy that way. But you might not recognize those white vase-like structures that there's roughly a dozen of those. Those are very high-tech digesters that take the sludge from the wastewater treatment plant, and under fairly high temperature conditions can, it's called CAMB is the process. It's a trademarked process, but they can break down the cell walls of the bacteria and fairly quickly generate the methane, which of course then can be used to generate electricity or used for heating or whatever other purposes that the plant needs, and create a very safe biosolid product afterwards, because all of any living material in there, any pathogens are done away with. So this is a practice that we're seeing in some of the very large wastewater treatment plants, and contributes to their pathway to energy neutrality. I show here DC Water, the wastewater facility that handles Washington, DC, and many of its suburbs. And I don't know if you can see this sort of drilled in on Washington, DC. This Blue Plains wastewater treatment plant is the largest, what they call advanced wastewater treatment plant in the world. And can you see off on the periphery here that they have solar collectors kind of all around the periphery of those basins there, and they've got plans for considerably more. And then at their new headquarters building, it's platinum LEED certified, and they've got all kinds of energy things there and water saving devices, including how to recover heat from their wastewater effluent. So my point is here that folks are trying to make change, and also, the use of green stormwater infrastructure, using natural systems to treat stormwater rather than sending that water to a centralized treatment plant. Just more examples of green roofs, green walls. I put all of that in that kind of how to optimize the system. People are doing things, and that's good, and they will continue to do things, and they're being rewarded for that. But what are some of the more let's say, what are some of the things that are going to help get us into a new future that many of us are intrigued in seeing? Well, so there's been a lot of work on, an increasing amount of work on what I call distributed water infrastructure. And the term is, of course, relative to distributed. It means distributed compared to what? Distributed compared to centralized. And it can come in all kinds of sizes. It can be a septic tank is a form of distributed infrastructure, or a rain barrel. But so that's down at one end of the spectrum. But in a community that maybe have 50 homes on septic, tying them together into one shared system, that might be centralized for them. But more and more communities are figuring out how to put some smaller scale treatment systems into their larger context. And I want to use this time to kind of talk about terminology. I use this term distributed water infrastructure. Some people use decentralized to describe it. I prefer, and I know a lot of other people prefer, the distributed term, because decentralized, I think it's really important that we not tee this up as one versus the other. Centralized is bad, distributed is good, or decentralized is good, because what that does is it sets up a false dichotomy and a false conflict between distributed and centralized. And it can be very off-putting to the people, the very people that we need to be in conversation with us. But it also, the fact of the matter is that these distributed systems are not disconnected from the larger treatment system. They are generally connected either by pipe or by logistical transfer of materials. And I think that in the future, we may also be looking at, as we start to look at how the business of wastewater is done and how to protect the public in the long run, especially those who may have are at least able to take care of their own facilities. We may be looking at business models where we still have a central utility, central management, but they're managing distributed physical assets. Anyway, I just want to kind of lay out this concept of distributed water infrastructure being a pathway towards the change that we want to see. And there's been a lot of work being done sort of in isolated pockets around the world. And all my examples are US examples, but I know full well that there are other places that are further ahead. And I want to highlight what I consider to be sort of the granddaddy of these systems, the Solaire building, residential high rise, the first residential high rise to be LEED Gold certified. And as part of that, it treats its wastewater in the ground floor of the building. And this is really revolutionary. And I think we might have someone here today who is from Natural Systems Utilities or has worked with Natural Systems Utilities who was behind this. And this was put in place in 2003. So, and it has been working, and now for all those years, and now in New York City, there are a number of high-rise buildings with these kinds of systems working, doing the treatment on site. Now they're still connected to the larger centralized system, but the most of the treatment is happening there in the building. The water is reused for non-potable uses in the building, taking pressure off the collection system and pressure off of the water distribution system. San Francisco is getting a lot of attention, as it well deserves, for advancing distributed water infrastructure. Here we see in their headquarters building that opened in 2012. It actually uses a green machine, a living system to do most of its wastewater treatment. Again, it's still connected to the overall sewer system, but doing a lot of the work on site. The city of Portland, Portland, Oregon, in the northwestern part of the United States, has one of what I think is one of the most interesting developments in the U.S., and that is, so in the the top picture there is an image of this area called the Lloyd Center District, and you can see the big old parking lot. Well, the city was anxious to have that redeveloped to bring new development into the community, but their aging sewer collection system really did not have the capacity to take on that new development. So how can they get that new development without having to rip up all their streets and put down larger pipes and all that sort of thing? So what they did was they worked with the developer. They said to the developer, basically, we will give you a refund on your development fees, and if you will build a system that doesn't tie into our collection system. So this Lloyd Eco District resulted in a project called Hasselo on 8th, and it's 4 blocks, 4 city blocks. Most of it had been parking lot. It now has 3 multi-use residential buildings, green roofs to help out with the stormwater, and then it has these red systems that you see here are trickling filters that treat the wastewater in conjunction with a series of treatment wetlands that take care of virtually all the treatment and allow for water reuse right there on site. And the solids that are resulting from that are trucked to the main treatment facility on a periodic basis. So this, as you can see, it has a 2.4 year project payback. And that was because it was in the city's best interest to encourage this type of development. And I don't know to what extent we'll be seeing this in other cities in the future, but I just think this is a really great example of how we're starting to see this sort of innovation in the context of a more standard collection system and treatment system. And then I also just want to do a light touch with smart technologies to point out that one of the things you may not think of all this digital stuff as being water infrastructure, but it is what is really it's a key component to allowing us to rethink the way that we do water infrastructure by because if you have distributed systems, you can't have somebody on site paying attention to them all the time. But as we increase our ability to monitor and actually manage from afar, that opens the door for distributed infrastructure. So how do we get to the stage of really transforming our systems? There are entities out there that are really working on how to have a transformative approach to water infrastructure. And I highlight Renew It, which is a collaboration of Stanford, New Mexico State University, UC Berkeley, and Colorado School of Mines. That Renew It stands for Reimagining Our Nation's Urban Water Infrastructure. And they have been going gangbusters in developing new technologies and new concepts and advancing, really helping us to reimagine how we could do water infrastructure. Cities with sustainability targets are laying out more aggressive timelines for some of these changes. And so whether it's using standards developed by the Living Building Challenge or the International Living Future Institute or other similar kind of paradigms to aim for net zero buildings, those are starting to really take hold of the imagination and help give cities tools for how they might transform their water infrastructure. I use Austin. Austin is in Central Texas. It has a decent amount of rainwater, but it primarily relies on groundwater for its water supplies. And it has just been growing like gangbusters for the last, 20 years, and is projected to keep doing that into the future. And they have created their innovative water forward plan. They're in their 100-year plan. They have set really aggressive targets for being able to recapture water from rain, from treatment of wastewater, from building drains, foundation drains, all those sorts of things, to really decrease the reliance on their centralized water distribution system. They see this as essential to their survivability. And when you get a plan like this that is so all-encompassing for a city, it's going to have transformative effects on how the water infrastructure overall works. The Bill and Melinda Gates Reinventing the Toilet Challenge from 2011, which is having, the goal here was to create toilets that can handle human waste, can work off grid for very little money and little to no energy input. This is captured the imagination of inventors and innovators all around the world, and how we can really rethink our toilet. David Sedlak and colleagues last year put out a concept, this personalized water system. It's really just conceptual, but this is one of the things coming out of Renew It. And maybe we won't really be building houses just like this, but to get people thinking about how can you have a largely or entirely off-grid house, and do this not just for the like people here who are sort of extreme innovators, but for the public as a whole. How do you make it easy for them, turnkey for them, so that they don't have to think about it? How do we completely change the paradigm around nutrient recovery from wastewater? This is an example of, there are a couple of different technologies here, but this particular one recovers phosphorus in the form of this chemical brushite we see off to the left. And then they can sell that as fertilizer. In their case, they sell it as really marketed at the general public rather than agriculture as a whole. But they are really rethinking how can we do that. And of course, in terms of really innovative stuff, we've got the Rich Earth Institute. And I think that the Rich Earth Institute and its collaborators really define the what I like to call the kind of the bleeding edge of innovation, really getting us to rethink how we might be able to do that, reimagine our infrastructure. But how do you make the change? And how does change really happen? Now, many of you have probably seen this technology adoption curve. It was created at the University of Iowa in application to agricultural change about 50 years ago. And they studied, who was most likely to take up these new innovations in agriculture. I think at the time it was hybrid corn that they were looking at. And they found that people kind of fell into one of these 5 categories. The innovators, and they are the bleeding edge people, or actually I think the bleeding edge people are probably off to even the left of that image. But the innovators, the ones that are most likely to take up to take up the innovation early on. And they found that in the study at University of Iowa that these people were tended to be more educated, and more risk-oriented, more comfortable with risk than the others. The early adopters tended to be younger and more educated, tended to be community leaders, not necessarily prosperous community leaders, but that was sort of the next category. And then the early majority adopters, they were a bit more conservative, but still open to new ideas, and they were able to influence their neighbors, and then eventually, everybody else came along. So Paul O'Callaghan, who's founder and CEO of Blue Tech Research, studied how this applies to the water sector. And he found that for a new technology in the water sector to kind of successfully move from bench to into that sort of early adoption phase, took a bit longer than we might hope, about 11 years. Now, there are reasons for this. And of course, that's assuming it makes it out of the lab and to a place where people can adopt it. But, water technology tends to be very long-lived. It's at least, 20 to 30 years, if not longer. I mean, much of our collection systems have been in place for 100 years, if not longer. It's highly regulated. There's a high cost of risk. If you fail, it could have huge ramifications both for the community and for an individual's reputation. And so those are some of the reasons why technology and practice adoption in the water sector moves kind of slowly, but it does move. And so that's the good news. There is change afoot. Now, one of the things that can accelerate that change is some kind of a crisis. So in the case of water innovation, some of these challenges with flooding, which is less of a problem for distributed technologies, with water scarcity, which can really drive interest in how to do sanitation with less or no water. These sorts of things could help bump things along that curve a little faster. But then I thought, I wanted to kind of look beyond our sector for some wisdom on these things. And last summer, Ed Clerico, who some of you may know, he's was the founder of Natural Systems Utilities and was the brains behind that Solaire building that I showed earlier. And he's been working on innovative water infrastructure for decades. And he recommended this book to me. Now, as it turns out, this guy, Damon Centolla, there's this whole community of scientists, social scientists who study how change happens. And, not surprisingly, our gut instincts about what drives change is not what the data kind of hold up as the way change really happens. So one kind of theory of change and for how people adopt new ideas is this, what's illustrated here as a viral contagion. And that's something that relies on very simple networks, weak social ties between the different nodes. And this model kind of works for something fairly contagious, like a virus, like gossip, or maybe even the news. That's a great way to kind of spread an idea and get someone to listen to it and remember it. But it turns out that doesn't work so well for complicated things. So on the right, we see a network that represents what Centolla would call a complex contagion. And it turns out these things spread differently. These are things that people resist. So you can't just tell them a juicy piece of gossip and they go, oh, that's pretty interesting. I'm going to tell my friend about it. These are things that need to overcome a strong network of beliefs and barriers. They are changes that involve risk, could be financial risk, psychological risk, reputational risk. And people need multiple lines of proof and reinforcement. And Centolla identifies 4 barriers for adoption of these sort of complex contagions. One is coordination. They have to be more appealing when they become more appealing when people use them together. Credibility. Before adopting, people want to know that the innovation is credible. And repeated confirmation by people that they trust is going to help them overcome that credibility barrier. Because remember, they've got strong networks. And so even if they hear it from one person, there may be a bunch of other people that not so sure about it. It needs social approval or legitimacy. People don't want to be embarrassed by a bad decision or have their reputations tainted by what is then perceived as a mistaken innovation. And it can also help if there's excitement. Some innovations are appealing, especially when people are kind of emotionally energized by one another, and that momentum can help with adoption. Now, it seems to me, I read this book, and when he started describing these complex contagions, I thought it was pretty obvious that changes in reinventing sanitation or reimagining our water infrastructure, these are complex contagions, very complex situations and ideas. So what are some of the fundamental strategies for how these kind of changes can take hold and how to get them to take hold? It's not going to rely on the contagiousness. This is not a simple contagion. You can't just expect that sort of this Oprah effect, that somebody talks about it and everybody else hears about it and they go, oh yeah, that's pretty cool, I'll do that too. It's not going to work here. And he says that you need to protect the innovators. So he's talking about you guys out there. And non-adopters can be countervailing influences, and they can really limit the adoption. So while things are being developed, you need to have this balance between creating safe spaces for the innovation to work itself through. But eventually you do need to be connected to others, which brings his point number 3 to to use the network periphery. What he means by that is that highly connected influencers can actually be roadblocks. And because there's a higher risk for them to make change, and because they have so many more connections pulling them back to the status quo. Santola, this author, recommends that the periphery is where one is more likely to find adopters, and that this is where the unfamiliar innovations can take hold. He talks about, now the last 3 points of his are a little bit more complicated, but in terms of creating relevance, using, finding clusters to help tip the social norm, and then also designing, he has some very specific ideas about how you design teams to reduce bias in the decisions and ensure that the innovations and the wisdom from the group can really take hold in driving those innovations. I won't go into detail with those, but so I got me thinking, like, who might be the allied interests in our periphery, and who might we reach out to in these safe spaces that may share some of our interests, may have an alignment. And I just, kind of did a little brainstorm that is by no means correct or complete, but these are just some of the kind of names of folks that I thought about. The American Rainwater Catchment Systems Association, they are definitely working on off-grid water distribution. And the on-site wastewater recycling guys, it's primarily the septic system people, but there's also a strong component of innovation in how we handle our wastewater there in their grouping. Green Building Council, all about trying to reduce water use in buildings. And anyways, we can continue through that list. I don't put too much weight on my particular list, but the point is we could sit down and really think about who else should we be bringing into our discussions. And it might not be the big guys, I guess is my point. And according to Santola, it might not, you don't want to start there. You're going to need to look to build that network with others on the periphery.
I'm just going to ask a quick follow-up while people are gathering their thoughts and questions. And that is that that bell curve slide about segments of the population responding to innovation. If I understood the small print correctly, that looked like it might have been, hold on a second, I just was looking at my notes. Was that something from Everett Rogers, and was that 1962?
That's right.
And my question is there any reason to think that that curve would look differently now, 60 years on? I'm guessing the answer is probably not in terms of how early adopters and such work, but I'm just curious if there might be reason to think it would look any different.
I don't think so. I mean, I think maybe you could drill into it and find the specific characteristics of people in the water sector or people who make decisions about the water sector and try to tailor it in that way. But no, I think one of the reasons why people keep pointing to that is because it has staying power. People haven't changed that much.
Right. Thank you.
I don't know if anybody saw, a couple of weeks ago, I saw this, I forget how it came across my desk, but the moo loo. Somebody heard of the moo loo? Some agricultural research, dairy researchers tried teaching dairy cows, young dairy cows, how to pee in a certain spot so that they could collect the urine separately from the rest of the dairy waste, because that solves a lot of problems for them. And it turns out that that young dairy cows learn at about the same rate as human toddlers. So yes, they are very trainable, getting them to pee at a certain spot. I think that in one of the things that struck me is that we do in the more traditional wastewater sector, there's lots of discussion about source separation when it's upstream from the waste sector, like trying to keep, well, especially these days, like trying to keep PFAS out of the waste stream, things like that. So talking about others upstream, but there's very little talk about the kind of source separation that we talk about at the Rich Earth Institute. And in fact, I found that when I talk to, over the last month or so, I've had a chance to say to people in, oh, I'm going to be at the Rich Earth Institute, and they say, well, what's that? And I describe, it's about urine separation. And they kind of look at me funny, and then I proceed to explain why this is a good thing, what the advantages of it are, and they go, oh, hadn't thought about that. So I think that this kind of gets back to Santola's point about you really want to strengthen the concepts and the relationships and the nodes out at the periphery of the network. I think that the vast majority of the people in the traditional wastewater world are not quite ready for this. And there's the Nancy Loves, and I forget who else is. There are a number of people here that are real leading thinkers in the wastewater world, but they are the very refreshing, teeny tiny tip of the iceberg at this point. So no, there is not a lot of talk about source separation in the traditional wastewater sector, even though there'd be a lot of advantages for them. Carol, your question about how to bring change, especially in the toilet blindness, it is very hard. And in fact, there are plenty of people who would say that to make the kind of broad scale change that we want to make, we do have to make it easy for people. People's lives are complicated. They don't want to have to think about their toilet. They don't want to have to think about how to maintain a system or any of that. So that's why I think that well, we may want to find ways to get them to care about why it's important. You still have to make it easy for them. And that's why I think these toilets that are sourced that can do the work for people are probably a really important tool. But it may be that the first innovations will be happening at, early innovations happening at places where there are men's urinals. And that's, you guys know, this is where the separation is already happening, and then we remix it. So how can you capitalize on some of those systems that may already be somewhat in place to, again, make it easy for people? I don't think it's, as much as I'd love for it to be, I don't think it's reasonable to expect that the world as a whole is going to be as interested in this as the rest of us are. What could be the role of WEF in promoting urine separation? Kai, I am thrilled that you were asking that question. When I got involved in WEF and applied to be on the board, this is now 7 years ago that I applied, or 6.5 years ago that I applied. I thought, I'm someone that I think of myself as being a kind of out of the box thinker and innovator. And I did not see myself as being like the other WEF members. And especially because I never worked at a wastewater treatment plant. I've never actually done the work that most of the WEF members do day in and day out. But I thought, if I want to make change, you can do it from the outside, or you can do it from the inside. And I thought, I want to try doing it from the inside. So anyways, I managed to get on the board, and I was not going to get on the board in the first week, say, hey, and I have a really different idea about how we should do everything. That didn't really seem like a good strategy to me. But fast forward, it's sort of slowly, well, the world has been changing, and I have been able to make my connections. And this past summer, I pulled together a small group of people. Oh, let me just say, the bottom line is, you don't need to care about all the details. The bottom line is that we are forming a group within WEF that is interested in distributed infrastructure. And so distributed water infrastructure. And Nancy Love has been part of this. I can't see all the names on here to know if there are other WEF members that are part of that small group. But so what I want to do is find the like-minded people within WEF and give them a home to be able to connect with each other. Within that, I imagine and hope that there will be some that are interested in urine separation. And maybe there will be a time when that group can run on its own. But Kai, I would love to connect with you individually or anybody else in this group who is active with WEF or is interested in becoming active with WEF and might want to be part of, hey, Nancy, okay, might want to be part of that. And in fact, I will say one of the, and Nancy was part of this at the WEF Tech, the huge conference that WEF puts on every year. We had it 2 weeks ago in Chicago in person. It was about half the size that it normally is, but it happened. And for the first time, we had an area for distributed water technologies. And I would say that it got a lot of interest. And we had a number of speakers. Nancy was on a panel that I hosted, but there was a lot of stuff happening there. And we still got a long ways to go, but it was the first time that we tried it and it got attention. So Nancy's has a question about Jim McCory now with Tetra Tech about source separation as an option to address their inefficient nutrient use. Oh, that's interesting. I was not aware that this is something that Jim McCory is interested in. So yeah. And I think that building, being able to take it beyond one building into a community, I think that's a really interesting idea. Nancy, I think I would love to take that, kind of follow up with you and with Jim on that. I love where you're coming from, Sean. And I will say that within WEF, there are some of the, and tends to be younger folks, are very interested in using terminology around poop and that sort of thing to bring the public into what we do and to engage them and get them to care and to think about this a little bit deeper and to have some fun with it. And it's a challenge for some people, I will say, because there are a lot of my colleagues who feel like, oh, we have spent decades trying to get people to take us seriously and now we're going to make light of it, but they'll come around. And Sean, I remember your presentation from last year that really influenced me. And I thought, oh my gosh, if we could get this kind of energy and into the more traditional parts of our sector, that would be great. Greg has a question that maybe is more addressed, Ivan, to you or to
yeah, I'll say something briefly, unless Abe or Kim want to jump in, as they probably have more technical information. But I'll say that in the short version, among the different facets of Rich Earth's work, which is, everything from people peeing into 5-gallon containers and lugging it to our centralized depot, to installing tanks in homes and public buildings like libraries and breweries. In some ways, the real cutting edge of the work that we are doing has been developing treatment technologies that could be part of building level treatment trains. And so we are very much interested in seeing that technology come to fruition. We're actually been making some really great strides. And there are certain locations where we believe our technology would be very well received, and we are following up on that. I'll just say quickly as another aside that just last week when we had an open house at our research center in Brattleboro, Vermont, and we had a prominent local architect visit who we had been really quite eager to talk with for some time. And when he learned about our treatment train technology developments, he on his own basically mentioned, well, I've got a few buildings in New England that I'm working on where I think this technology, might be a really good fit. So we're really excited to follow up with him. So that's a short answer. And I said there may be some other rich earthers who want to say a little bit more. I know we've got about 5 minutes left in this panel, but that's at least a short answer.
What you're doing here at Rich Earth is so incredible. And I think it probably feels like it can feel like you're toiling alone, but I do think that, I guess the main message from me is that I've seen it's still a small portion of the overall, wastewater world, but I see an openness to new ideas and really innovative thinking that I didn't see a couple of years ago, and it's very encouraging. So
that is encouraging. And in fact, let's face it, it's a necessity that we move forward in this direction. And certainly, in addition to the communications we have with our collaborators and supporters, the summit is certainly a time where we realize that we are far from alone. And that's one of the best aspects of being all together.